Ravi here to give you a Northwestern recap and a Purdue game preview this weekend. Nebraska wins last weekend 17-9 over Northwestern, and what's fair to say an ugly but gritty game, I think. What surprised you? What didn't surprise you? Just kind of what were your immediate reactions after that game?
Yeah, I was, obviously thought it was really encouraging that they were able to find a way to win that one. Coach Rhule said in his post-game presser that earlier in the year, that's not a game that they would have won. And I think going back several years, that's not a game Nebraska has won in recent history. I really don't think their performance was all that different than what we saw at Minnesota with some of the miscues, some of the turnovers, things like that. Obviously, against Minnesota, they weren't able to overcome that and come out with a victory. Against Northwestern, they were. And, yeah, you can say, okay, opponents are a little different. Even though Northwestern beat Minnesota, I think Minnesota's probably a little bit better football team. But it's less about the opponent and more about Nebraska's ability to overcome mentally those errors that, whether it's, throwing picks on your first two possessions and putting your defense in that position is pretty brutal. Having 3 fumbles, even if you don't lose them, those are drive killers, right? You're putting yourself in a position where it's really hard to succeed, and then to still be able to succeed in those moments, I thought was really impressive and has kind of shown the growth of where this team has come from week 1 on August 30th when they're playing at Minnesota and aren't able to climb that hill after shooting themselves in the foot. This is a team that it's going to be ugly all year, right? All the wins are going to be ugly, but they're still wins.
Yeah. I kind of have I think a synopsis of how I've thought of this team after this past weekend. And I highlighted it after the game. I said the 2 most impressive plays for me were Omar Brown and Malcolm Hurrdat. When Northwestern had the shots down the field, and instead of quitting on those plays when they got beat, which I feel like we're used to seeing in the past, there was no quit. It was actually sped up, got faster, tackled, knocked them out of bounds. And I think when I said after the game it was an ugly win, but that's just kind of what this team's going to be right now. I think when I think of the identity of this team, the offense is going to have to be gritty and tough to get it done when they can. But I think they have a defensive core that is willing to supplement them and know, hey, this side of the ball is hurt and injured, and they're trying to get whatever they possibly can. Yeah. And it seems like the defensive side is willing to step up at any time and say, like, we got you. We got it. And in both of those times down the field, Malcolm Hurrdat has the open field tackle to keep them short, and then they hold them again. They did not get 7 points out of either of those drives. So I think if I think the identity of this team and what this win looks like compared to years previous, I think those 2 plays stand out to me because in times where those would have maybe been game deciders to give Northwestern a win, this held Nebraska in control still.
Yeah, Matt Rhule talks a lot about going 1-0 every week. I kind of extrapolated that last week to say, it's more about going 1-0 every play. But even in those plays, they had a couple different opportunities to go 1-0 within the same play, right? Because, hey, they got beat on the run, and then they got beat on the pass deep. But they had an opportunity to come back and pick themselves up within the same play and still go 1-0 on that next portion
Malcolm
of the
was
play.
the one that got beat.
Yes.
He makes the tackle in the following play.
And then he goes and recovers and still goes 1-0 on that play to give yourself another chance, right? It's just about giving yourself another opportunity and not letting one play beat you or not letting one mistake beat you. And that mentality, like I said, these wins, like you said, these wins are going to be really ugly. Even the losses are going to be ugly, whatever's left on there in the rest of the schedule. It's not going to be pretty football pretty much the rest of the way out. I'd be shocked if it ever was, right? But the foundation that ugly football sets you for when you do start to either upgrade talent or just get healthy on the offensive side of the ball, or you start to execute a little bit better on those in those areas, it sets you up to be so much more successful. Because if you already know how to win when things get ugly, then when things get a little bit easier or things get a little bit better in terms of health or execution or talent or whatever the case is, then you become that much better of a football team because you have such a solid foundation of, hey, things don't have to go right for us to win. Things don't have to be easy or pretty or clean for us to win. We'll beat you in the mud too, and then as you upgrade in those areas, you can win in the mud or you can win a clean, well-executed football game, it makes them that much more dangerous moving forward.
Well, Rhule said it yesterday. He's like, on film, that's winning football to me. He's like, I don't care what the score is at that point. When I watch that, that's winning football. So I know in his mind, too, it's fun when you make an analysis after the game and be like, that was important, right? And then Coach Rhule says it on Monday, and you're like, okay, cool. Great. I'm glad we thought that was both good, big plays. But before we get to the Purdue game, I wanted to talk about maybe the plan of attack that Nebraska had last weekend. It seemed a little bit confusing, I feel like, for a lot of people. And I guess myself, just because we broke the game down, looked at the numbers on paper, I was expecting a huge rushing game for Nebraska, especially because the week previously, coming off the bye week, it felt like, we're going to cultivate this running back room, get EJ some more touches on the ball, try to have kind of a 1-2 punch situation here. Heinrich had 85 passing yards. He was 8 for 17. Emmett Johnson did have 73 rush yards. So there was that. I think that was an encouraging number. But how often Nebraska threw the ball, that seemed surprising to you as well.
Yeah, it did. And honestly, before I looked at the box score, I thought it was more.
I did too.
And proportionally, it's really not even that much, right? It's 39 rushes, 17 passes. That's probably in the neighborhood of the ratio. I mean, that's better than a 2-to-1 ratio of run to pass. But because of what the game, or because of what the talent and the health situation looks like on the offensive side of the ball, you are missing all those wide receivers, and then Billy Kemp goes out,
right?
Because you've got a quarterback back there that doesn't have a ton of experience and sometimes does look uncomfortable throwing the ball in certain situations or executing at kind of a precise level in the passing game. I've said this before, even before all the wide receiver injuries, and I was like, I feel like maybe 12 to 15 passes a game is kind of where they need to live because it does limit the opportunity for mistakes. Now, it also limits the opportunity for things like we saw to Malachi Coleman, where they have that pass down the field. But it's really tricky, and I think part of it, so I was surprised by the amount of passing, and like I said, it felt like more in the moment. I do think part of what happened there, and you heard Coach Rhule talk about this, was Billy Kemp was a huge part of that game plan.
Yeah.
And when Billy Kemp went down, I do think it threw him into a little bit of a flux in terms of trying to adjust on the fly, figure out, hey, what do we still have on this offensive side of the ball that can work, that we feel good about? And then you get offensive line injuries, and you go, okay, do we feel good about still getting a push in the run game? Do we feel good about still trying to run over that left side where that was kind of our strength, and now all of a sudden we're losing 2 starters for the rest of the season? Then Ben Scott goes out for a minute, and then Newelly goes out for a minute, and you're like, okay, this is getting kind of dicey here in a hurry. So I have such a hard time evaluating this offense because of all of the injuries and guys that are missing right now. It's like, you want to be critical. It's like, hey, they only had 240 yards of total offense. They only had 85 passing yards, and 44 of them came on one play to Malachi Coleman. Like, aside from that, he's 8 for 16 for 41 yards. That's not a good day.
Right.
But at the same time, you go, okay, how much better could it actually be with the situation they're in? It's a really tough group to evaluate right now.
Well, moving quickly into the Purdue preview side of this, Purdue is 2-5 coming off a bye week. Big loss to Ohio State the last game they played 2 weeks ago. Nebraska coming off a win, but like we just mentioned, a much more injured team now, and all on one side of the ball. Today, you guys talked to a Purdue writer, and it kind of seems like there's a lot of similarities on the offensive side. Nebraska, an injured offensive line, a Purdue kind of just a struggling offensive line. How does that kind of match up, you think, on the field this weekend?
Yeah, so I do expect Nebraska to win this game because I think they've already shown they're capable of, kind of like we said, getting down in the dirt, getting down in the mud, and winning a game in the ugliest fashion possible. I don't know that Purdue has really shown that yet. I mean, one of their 2 wins this year was a blowout of Illinois at 44-19. They had the win over Virginia Tech earlier in the year, but I mean that was a long time ago. That was 5 games ago at this point. That was in kind of mid-September. I don't know if that's still the team you can kind of expect from Purdue out on the field right now, because their season was in a way different spot at that time. I think they do struggle up front, and even though they've run the ball pretty well, and Maccabee really hurt Nebraska last year, although a lot of that was because of how they were trying to defend Aiden O'Connell in that passing game, Nebraska's run defense is the strength of that team. With the way Nebraska has developed and cultivated that defensive line play, which has been incredible, like truly shocking, honestly.
Eight tackles for loss, 13 sacks. Didn't even mention that part this past weekend.
Yeah, and I think every I think there were 8 different players that had at least half a sack.
Yeah, there was like over 6 players that had 6 tackles, I think, or 5 tackles.
Yeah, it's an incredible defensive effort and development, and the way that Tony White and the other position coaches there have done on defense. I think they'll do well against the Purdue rushing game. The Purdue passing game really doesn't scare me a ton, because even though Hudson Card is probably one of the better quarterbacks left on Nebraska's schedule, the wide receiver room at Purdue is really not super scary or impressive, and I like Nebraska's secondary, right? I think Purdue is going to have a really hard time scoring against Nebraska. Now, conversely, Nebraska is going to have a hard time scoring against everyone because of the condition of their offense, but Purdue's defense is not a world beater crazy defense that I think Nebraska definitely has the advantage there. Now, they are going to have to take shots.
Yep.
That secondary of Purdue is their weak point. Their front, it's really a front 5 because of the way Ryan Walters aligns his defensive line, but their front 5 is probably the strength of their defense, so Nebraska's going to have to be persistent with the run. But in order to score, I think they're going to have to take shots like they did to Malachi Coleman. I think, those, like that route to Alex Bullock that ended up being incomplete, that's the route that they have to execute on and hit, because otherwise they're going to have an even harder time scoring the ball if they're not executing on the plays that actually do hit.
Right.
So that's going to be key to me. Is Nebraska able to hit on some of those downfield shots? And that's where I think they're going to have the most out of their offense on Saturday, because I just don't think Purdue is strong enough on the back end to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, and also it sounds like the weather might also be an impact this weekend for the first time. So I'm curious to see how that maybe has some implications on performance or just outcome, ball security, that kind of thing. But like you mentioned, Hudson Card, as we know, Texas transfer, he'll throw it around a good amount. He likes to throw it a little. He's got over 1,600 passing yards. But that also comes with 5 interceptions, and he just doesn't rush a ton. So I think with the strength,
he's pretty mobile.
He is mobile,
but he doesn't run it a ton.
Doesn't run a lot, and I think it says 0.5 yards average a game, something like that. So with the strength of Nebraska's D line and also just the backfield as well, I think this proves as another huge opportunity for this defense to manufacture points for Nebraska this weekend.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how they're going to defend Hudson Card, because you heard Coach Rhule talk about it a little bit, that they may not – it sounds like they may try and contain him a little more than put pressure on him the way they have some less mobile quarterbacks. As you mentioned, about half a yard a carry. He's got 26 total yards on the season.
Yep.
So it's not like he's having these huge gash plays, but if you give him the opportunity where you're not staying true to your assignments and staying true to your lanes on the defensive line, you are going to have some trouble there, or potentially could have some trouble there. But I do think this defense is going to have to create scoring opportunities for the offense, whether it's forcing Hudson Card into some turnovers, whether it's just putting that offense in a position where you're constantly winning the position, the field position battle. Either way, I think that's going to be, and that's the next step for this defense, right? Is to go from really solid to even really good. But to take that next step is to create turnovers, to create scoring opportunities for the offense. And I think with the amount of pressure they put on quarterbacks, with the talent in the defensive backfield, I think it's inevitable at some point that the dam kind of breaks and they start creating a lot more turnovers. Yeah,
we heard from Coach Rhule. Last thing, he talked yesterday about 30 minutes or so, and I always think there's a lot of fun stuff he tucks in there. So just from what you heard yesterday, whether it be the Northwestern game, Purdue game, kind of in general, just what stood out the most?
Yeah, I mean, the thing for me with Coach Rhule was, and he sort of practiced this a lot or talked about it a lot, is – the cost of doing things. Like, if you're going to do something that you haven't done before, there's a cost to it. And he kind of said that in conjunction with the pro scout, saying it's the second hardest practice he's seen in the country after Georgia. And Coach Rhule is very quick to say, and we're going to catch him. And we're going to catch him on that. And the fact that he is just so open and upfront about, hey, we are going to ask you to do incredibly hard things. Because I feel like a lot of times, especially in an era where there's so much concern about, hey, you don't want to run guys off because of the transfer portal and things like that, and you have to try and kind of almost fool recruits into wanting to come here, whether it's high school guys, whether it's transfer guys, whatever. And he's just really upfront and honest and say, hey, if you come here, we would love to have you. We're going to ask you to do some really hard things. And it's going to prepare you, whether you're in the NFL, whether you're, like you said, working for Google, whatever you're doing, right? It's going to prepare you for that, and you're going to be more successful because of it, but it's going to be really hard. And I just really appreciate that he doesn't really try and sugarcoat it. He really doesn't try and convince guys like, hey, there's an easy way out or there's a shortcut to do it. It's almost like he goes out of his way to do things the hard way because he knows long term that's better for you. And that to me is one of the most consistent things that he's talked about. And you can tell he takes so much pride in it.
Yeah.
When he said, hey, you're the second hardest practicing team that we've seen in the country, he looked like he had so much pride in it, but then he's still striving for more. He's like, yeah, and we're going to catch Georgia too. That to me was kind of Coach Rhule in a nutshell, that moment. That's what he's all about, and I love seeing that.
I also love how he paused, be like, and I didn't say that. That was my words.
Yeah,
don't come after me. Don't come after me. I also think the other thing that I really like that he said, we got into the weather conversation.
Yeah.
And he was like, there's a benefit to having the guys on our team that are from here.
Yeah.
They grew up in this. And I think you think about recruiting and you think about the home field advantage and playing in front of your family, but it hasn't really dawned on me that's, in a kicking position. Like, he grew up here. There's a guy from Montana, and I loved what he said about Tristan because I love watching Tristan in warm-ups because I love to watch his adjustments before because then I like to see in the game what happens. And I love that he was like, did you need that in the state final? He's like, get off the field. And Coach wasn't really here yet for that state final. So he paid attention. He knows his guys, and I just think there's a lot more that goes into that recruiting that obviously just doesn't dawn on us all the time when it comes to weather and what a home field kid or a home kid kind of brings to a team. But that's all we have for you today. Northwestern recap, Purdue preview. We'll be here next week, and we'll see what happens next week.
A Hurrdat Sports Network production.